Hey, everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And for some of you, you're like, oh, you're Matt. It's nice to meet you. I'm so-and-so. This is my first time listening to this podcast that right now is about the book of Matthew. This is great. It's nice to be here. Others of you are like, I know your name, dude. Been doing this for 300 and some odd episodes. Well, hey, it's good to see you again. And for me, it's particularly good to see you again because it has been an age. I've had a bunch of company coming into town and travel and stuff I've needed to do. I went and recorded a video in Salt Lake City that I'm really excited about putting out on the YouTube channel. It's another one of those where I go and visit a church. And so I've been on the run, and I feel like we haven't sat down and talked about the Bible and done this thing that we do together every day forever. So it's really good to be bumming around together, thinking about the Gospel of Matthew, thinking about the Bible, and trying to do it without my dumb biases getting in the way. I mean, ultimately, they're going to leak through to some degree, but it's fun working on this together and trying to strip that stuff away and just understand what the text says on its own merits. And we are in Matthew chapter 15 right now. We're about the halfway point. I would argue we are at the thematic halfway point for sure of the book of Matthew. And we just got done with a passage that when I was recording it, I was like, well, this could be a little controversial because some people might look at this through 21st century lenses and be like, whoa, Jesus sounds super racist here. And I thought, well, I better tackle this question. I don't know that I've ever heard anybody accuse Jesus of being racist, but I don't know, it'll make for a good conversation and a good way to frame up the juxtaposition of Jesus' difficult exchange with this Canaanite Syro-Phoenician woman, where it looks like maybe he's insulting her or something because she wants help, but then it looks like something else is going on there in terms of the social dynamic because he flips it around and he heals this lady's daughter as she has requested. But then the crazy thing is that after I recorded it, a video came out on TikTok where a guy was like, no, Jesus was a total racist and Jesus repented of his sins here and turned from his racism. And it's a bad read. I know I don't say that very often, and I don't want to just be totally critical of somebody else, but it's a really bad take. It's what's called eisegesis. The guy was looking at one little verse and just ramming 21st century American political assumptions down the throat of the text. And I mean, look, if you've been hanging out here at all, you know that the question of racial tensions between some Canaanite lady up north and the Jews is not at all the central concern of Jesus or Matthew or the point of this book, and all of the context doesn't point to that in any way. So I think it was a pretty ugly, pretty bad read and pretty theologically flawed if the dude was operating off of what the Bible says, because it's holding Jesus out as being right in all of his judgments. And the gentleman on TikTok who made this argument was suggesting that Jesus was dead wrong in his take and that this lady spoke truth to power, and then Jesus repented of his racism and changed. And, well, it just made me pause and be grateful that we're doing this thing the way we're doing it, because we're doing wise, wide open faith here. I mean, you've had a really good look at this for yourself. If you want to know what Jesus thought about race stuff, well, you got to read all of the book of Matthew, and you got to consider all of the themes and points and undercurrents of the story. And when you see that, what you realize is the exact opposite is true. He's hanging out with people who are socially anathema. He's hanging out with people who are gender anathema. He's hanging out with people who are ethnically anathema. And Jesus, he just seems to not care. He blows through all of these barriers, because he's the new Abraham and he is the fulfillment and completion of the Old Testament stuff that said that there was going to be this great nation, but that this great nation that would be born out of Abraham would be a blessing to all the nations. And Jesus, Matthew 5:17, is the fulfillment of that. And this should be read with excitement on the part of the original audience to say, like, whoa, this is a gigantic change that is happening here. And this means that God really was for everybody all along. And it's fitting then that this is happening in Gentile territory. And in verse 29, we pick it up at the end of this exchange that Jesus has with this lady. At verse 28, he answered her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. So ringing in our ears as we move into the next passage is this motif of Jesus having women particularly seem to get who he is and be willing to even risk looking like a fool to approach him and then being rewarded for that bravery. We're seeing that a whole bunch already. We're going to see it a whole bunch more moving forward. And also we see this motif of Jesus encountering people who aren't ethnically Jewish and being like, whoa, you get it. This is crazy. And then he points out to whoever's in the room, like, hey, this is what faith looks like. That's awesome. And then he does the miraculous thing that I guess kind of seals the deal. So that is rattling around in our head. Now we're all reset, and we pick it up in verse 29 of Matthew 15. It says, Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. And the people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. On the one hand, this feels like a quick pivot, transitional passage. But on the other hand, it seems like we got a bunch of callbacks here to really important ideas that we have seen get unpacked in Jewish territory earlier in the book of Matthew. He's been on the road for a long time outside of Jewish territory. He leaves the place where he runs into the Syrian lady, and he comes back down along the Sea of Galilee. Now, I think most likely, since thematically here in Matthew 15, it looks like we're dealing with the question of the redemptive work of God being opened up to the non-Jewish larger audience. So I'm assuming that we're on the part of the Sea of Galilee that is a little bit more on the east, like the 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock position on the Sea of Galilee, if you imagine it as being a clock, which would be Gentile territory. Then a whole bunch of people show up, and this is what we've been encountering all along. The crowds come, and they've got the same kind of problems every time. They're lame, they're blind, they're crippled, they're mute, they're sick. But look, they do this thing that we're seeing throughout Matthew and that is really pronounced throughout Luke, and that is that the people in need, the people who believe that Jesus can do something about their problem, they assume what the gospel authors are holding out as being a right position before the king, a physical manifestation of a position of submission before the king. I can't fix my problems. You can fix my problems. So I'm going to be here at your feet. I'm going to be here on my knees in a position of supplication to you, a king. And so even though we don't get the same verbal confirmation of these other Gentiles' recognition of Jesus as king or a regal heir, as we got from the Syrian or Canaanite woman here just a minute ago when she called Jesus the son of David, we're still getting the physical communication that they believe there is something authoritative and kingly about him. But this also harkens back, as people with these problems showed up in verse 30 and then in verse 31, as people with these problems get taken care of and they praise God, it harkens back to Matthew chapter 11, when John the Baptist's disciples come to Jesus and they're like, hey, just, I don't know, stuff's kind of weird. And John, who I know you guys are related or whatever, he just wanted us to ask you just a quick question, like if you are actually the Messiah or if there was somebody else that we should be looking for. And Jesus is pretty chill about it, but it's still a bit of a feisty response. He's like, hey, we'll go back and report to John what you hear and see. Remember this part? Verse 5 of Matthew chapter 11. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who doesn't fall away on account of me. And that's a callback to Isaiah 35 and all of the things that the prophet Isaiah said would happen when the Messiah shows up. So this begs the question, are we just getting another repetition of this in case we missed it in chapter 11? Now we'll be really, really, really sure that we caught that all the things that are supposed to happen when the Messiah shows up are happening? Or is there more to this? Would the original audience have been geographically crystal clear that Jesus was in Gentile territory, that he's interacting with Gentile people, and now all of the Messiah stuff is happening there too? Pretty big implications if those signs of the Messiah got repeated to not Jewish people across the way over into Gentile territory. Again, though, when you and I encounter this text, most of us are not Jewish, and some of us are. High five and hello to my Jewish listener friends, but most of us aren't. We're Westerners, and we're reading this through the lenses of the individual faith and church life and how society ought to be. We don't have an ethnic question that goes along with this. We don't have a historical question that goes along with this. But the New Testament is written to an audience that would have had some of those questions, and things would have popped off the page to them that don't pop so much for us. So the second half of Matthew chapter 15, not that big a deal for a modern non-Jewish reader. I think to the original audience, Matthew chapter 15 would have popped like crazy, though, because people would have been like, whoa, 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 that's all the same stuff. Like, you said this here, you did this here, you performed these miracles here. That's what the Jewish Messiah is supposed to do for the Jewish people. Wait a dang minute. Are you just like the Messiah for like everybody? Is this going to be more than a regional religion? But I think that's a pretty important question or concept to have rattling around in our noggins as we try to process through what is happening here in Matthew chapter 15 and how the original audience would have read it and what Matthew is trying to communicate here. We got a lot more time to unpack this, which we will take in the upcoming days. Quick note, Allie raised a really important question for me regarding our Jeff Foot musical Easter egg challenge. And thank you for this, Allie. You're making everything better. Apparently, there was some ambiguity in the way I phrased it regarding how broad the scope of the Jeff Foot Easter egg music challenge is. I am interested in your take on everything. The first 400 episodes, by the time we get to episode 400, I want to know your take on all of the Easter egg outro music that Jeff made and why you think it is there. So everything is fair game, dating all the way back to episode 0, episode 1, whatever I called it. And hopefully that offers a little bit of clarification and more opportunities to interact with my buddy Jeff's amazing musical talents. And if this is your first time here and that sounded like inside baseball and you're like, what, Easter eggs, contest, what are we doing? Don't worry about any of that. That'll make more sense later on. We'll cover it again a bit down the road. For now, I'm going to hit timeout and we'll be back to Matthew 15 mañana. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.